moment. Let me know when you can see it.
You can see it.
Awesome. Great. So, so this is a little bit of a background for you to understand the various elements of my session. So we're going to talk about the legal entity, why it's important, how to choose the important aspect of your business, which is the legal partner or the law firm. Also, for you to understand a few legal concepts, it's important to know various startup lingo or legal lingo in the startup space, so to speak. And then we have a few key contracts that are important for founders to know, founders to kind of familiarize themselves with. And then we move into intellectual property, which has been one of my favorite fields of law, and which is super important for startups in general because one is IP is to a certain degree is the basis of your valuation, your USP, and so on and so forth. The last two are about regulations, how you sort of navigate through them. Depending on your business and the jurisdiction that you are based out of or the country that you want to operate out of, there can be a whole network of regulations that overlap, and you will need to figure them out and be able to be legally compliant and operate your business. And lastly, figure out how legal applies to your business. What are the various, not only regulations, but also changes or up and coming new developments in the field of law that affect your business. So to open up the session, we'll start off with the legal entity. So why it's important to have a legal entity, right? So one is for Founder Institute, you'll know that you need to have a legal entity to be able to sign the warrants and basically complete your course. But that besides the point, you also need to know and have a legal entity. One, because you need to have a separate entity where you bill customers, clients, basically get revenue in, right? The second is where you make expenses from. You don't want to be making these expenses either from your personal account or an account that is, for example, of different co-founders and so on and so forth. It will get very, very messy to backtrack it and have all of your accounts and receivables and expenses set up in one place, right? Now, besides that, the other main reason for you to have this is for your personal liability protection, right? So that means once you have a legal entity, whether it's a LLP, a limited liability company, whatever the case may be, right? That entity is what is then responsible and basically handles all of the liability, right? So when somebody, if God forbid, situation were to come up that they want to sue you, they would sue your entity versus you as an individual, right? Now, why is that different and how does that impact you? For example, you have assets, whether it's a house, a car, any sort of other assets to your name. Those aren't linked or cannot be brought into the legal suit, right? You are limited to the company's assets, the company's shares, the company's um, revenue, right? Which is what can only be paid out from, right? The other reason, which is very, very important, especially for when you're doing a more global business, is the tax liability, right? So, for example, you're doing business in the US, in India, in Brazil, in the UAE, as well as in, let's say, some parts of Asia, right? You'll need to be able to have an entity where you're registered as a tax entity and you're paying whether it's GST, VAT, whatever the case may be, right? Because you will not only be in different circumstances be liable for corporate tax or which is usually tax when you make profit, right? But also to collect sales tax on behalf of the government of the jurisdiction that you're set up and operating out, right? These are the few reasons why it's important to have a legal entity. Now we'll move on to some of the best practices on how to choose your legal entity, right? And what you need to understand while setting up your legal entity. So one is you'll have agreements between the founders and other shareholders. And these are, of course, your co-foundership agreement and your shareholders agreement, right? These are two base agreements that are to a certain degree going to be how your entity's relationship between you as individuals and, of course, eventually your investors, who will most likely be shareholders to a certain degree in your business, work and function, what they cannot do, how they are investing, how they're getting a return, so on and so forth. The other aspect is choosing a suitable legal entity for your startup, right? So when I say a suitable, it does not mean that what is the quick fix, what is able to solve this problem of not having an entity right now, but what will you need in the next 3 to 5 years, right? So try to future proof your corporate entity and don't go straight forward to open, like, let's say, a one-person company, if that's something that in your jurisdiction is possible, right? Because the limitation is that the one-person company can't have other shareholders, right? So if you do have an investor, then you'll have to change the type of entity that you have to either a limited liability company or a limited liability partnership or something else, right? Maybe a holding company as well. The other thing that you need to be important, know and be aware of is exclusivity agreements, right? So this can come up in two forms. One is if you're an entity or a business that is, let's say, taking up a licensing agreement or getting some software from a different company. It could be in the sense of a distribution agreement with the manufacturer or the one who's basically giving you the product. Supposing you're importing your product and you're reselling it into the market after assembling it locally or whatever the case may be, right? Then you need to be wary of getting into exclusivity agreements, especially early on in your career. The other aspects are with regards to intellectual property, which I'll get to at the later segment of my session, and complying with specific laws. Now, these are with regards to setting up entities, right? So specific laws for setting up entities, you'll need to know which jurisdictions you'll be able to set up a legal entity, which allows you to, let's say, operate legally in that jurisdiction or in the number of jurisdictions that you want to legally operate in, right? Whether it's multiple jurisdictions or one, it's important to understand which specific laws will apply to you. And lastly, of course, tax planning, which can be done by having a holding company in a tax negative jurisdiction or a jurisdiction that has low or no tax, depending on what type of business you may want to either set it up in, let's say, Dubai, Delaware, Ireland, or other parts of Asia like Singapore. These are to a certain degree known as tax efficient or tax havens jurisdictions, and they help in basically allowing money to flow through your organization by not paying obscene amounts of taxes. Now we'll move into the next segment, which is about how to choose a law firm. I understand this is a little wordy slide, and I would like to have you all either screenshot this and just go over this at a later point in time in more detail when you have it. But this is about how to choose the law firm that you want to work with, right? So this is very important because in the initial stages, you can go wrong with wrong legal advice, and ultimately, for you to get some sort of a remedy, you would either have to sue that law firm or lawyer to get anything out of it, and you most likely won't have the funds to do that. And ultimately, the lawyers all have insurances that back them up. So it's important that you go ahead with the right lawyer, interview different law firms, different lawyers at these law firms, and understand how it is they work, right? So you need to ask them a few questions, and that's what I've put down, right? So this can be as a small questionnaire for you when you go ahead into your interviewing process with different law firms, right? You need to know what type of a legal practice do they have. You don't want to be going to a lawyer that generally does court work and litigation and things of that nature. You would want a lawyer that not only deals with corporates but also has a niche or has a separate practice for startups, or maybe if you're a tech startup, then specifically for tech startups, right? You need to understand how many clients they have in that space. Who are the clients? Are they big? Are they medium? Are they small? Do they have a range of these types of clientele, right? You need to know, have they been part of investment rounds, fundraisers, done mergers and acquisitions, and so on and so forth, right? So these are certain things that you need to understand when it comes to the type of work that they do, and what type of a law firm can advise you better, right? Next is you would want to know on how the day-to-day would be like, right? When you're working with a law firm, you would want to know, will you have a sole point of contact? Will you have either a partner or a senior associate or somebody higher up that you can, pick up the phone, have a quick call. Hey, I'm planning to do this. Is this the right move? Is this something that I should get into? How do I structure that? Somebody that can give you quick advice, but at the same time, sound and legally valid advice, right? You may not want to have a law firm that you need to speak to the assistant figures out when's the appointment is scheduled, maybe anywhere between 3 to 5 business days, and then by that time your opportunity or your solution is either solved or gotten worse even, right? So ask them who is going to be your primary contact person. How are you going to answer? How are they going to answer these questions? Do you generally engage into specialists? Like, let's say they're a corporate law firm and they don't necessarily have a separate intellectual property department. Then how are they going to also help you with intellectual property related matters, right? Or let's say they don't have an department for corporate structuring. How is it they're going to help you set up an entity in another jurisdiction? Do they have specialists on board, or do they going to have to, figure that out and go ahead and interview 2, 3 law firms or 2, 3, corporate counsels that will help with setting up these companies? So it's important to know these things. And lastly, and most importantly, is how the firm works. What's their culture like, right? Is it more open, fluid, having a very non-hierarchical structure, or is it something that's more rigid, very structured, and maybe that's something that you find important to have and will be interesting for you to experience as well, because most of the large law firms, they have a very structured approach to how they deal with clients, how they deal with billing, how they deal with various teams, and of course the work that they deliver to their clients, right? So these are all important things that you need to figure out. Last and not least is the costs, right? How expensive are they, and how affordable are they? Depending on that is what I believe most startup companies and founders will want to pick the lawyers on, but that's not the most important thing, and that should not be your main motto, right? You need to figure out if there can be alternative payment options and models as well. And most of the startup lawyers, they do have alternative payment options. Um, Now to move on quickly to um, the fact of how do you effectively manage the law firm that you've engaged. So once you've done that, you need to sort of set up deadlines, have stand-up meetings, whether it's once a week, once a month, whatever that frequency is, you decide that and have those catch-up meetings with them, right? Also, as I mentioned earlier, it's important to have a sole point of contact, whether they're a partner, senior associate, or somebody that's assigned to your business, right? Also, be importantly, you need to also understand how timely and efficient payment plans work, right? So whether you're on either a retainer model or, for example, a fixed fee model or even an hourly billed model, right? You need to have a way of understanding how much you're going to bill and expense all of your legal obligations. Have all the legal fees negotiated up front. It's very important. You don't want to have surprises, hidden costs, and so on and so forth. Try to make everything to be as transparent and as clear for you as possible. Now, we'll move on to some of the legal concepts. Some of these you might have heard about in my session already, but I'll get into the details of what they are, right? So you have a stockholder or a shareholder agreement, you have your operating agreement, and your co-foundership. These are all in the same point because they're quite often used interchangeably when they're not the same. They are also quite often mistaken for the same document, right? Now, co-foundership agreement is an internal document. It's between you and your two, three partners or co-founders, as you may like to call it, right? Now, co-founder is not a term that has a legal definition, right? Unlike a partner, unlike a shareholder, right? So when we come to a shareholder, the shareholder is an actual legal definition of what a shareholder is. It's essentially somebody that owns a share, right? Now, co-founders can also be shareholders and will also most likely sign that shareholder agreement. But there may be other people that will sign that shareholder agreement, and that's between the shareholders and the entity. With regards to an operating agreement, this is most likely if you're setting up an entity in like the US, an LLC sort of entity. These are agreements or a suite of agreements. It could be your memorandum of association, your articles of association. These are essentially agreements that are almost always set templates given by the regulatory authority that is providing you with the license or allowing your entity, excuse me, to be set up and registered. Now we come to debt or financing agreements. Now these are agreements with regards to investment, right? So you can have different sorts of investment types, but they're broadly defined or separated between debt or equity. Debt is essentially a loan where you're taking money for a provided and providing them a promissory note that you will basically repay this loan over a period of time with a given set amount of interest. Sometimes you may require to give equity as well in terms of a debt, but most cases it's simply a loan. Equity financing is very straightforward. It's where you essentially give equity in exchange for the amount of investment that somebody's making in you. And that's usually done on the basis of your valuation. It can be either pre-money or post-money. Now, pre-money is basically when you've not yet started making revenue. Post-money is once you've actually started making revenue and once you've essentially done a price round. A price round is once you've done an investment round that has either an institutional investor like a VC or a private equity fund, and it has a tangible valuation that is backed by a document. And that's essentially what you would call as a priced round. You have restrictive covenants, intellectual property assignment. Now, assignment of IP is super important because um, when intellectual property is created, whether it's by a freelancer, by somebody from your team, by a co-founder, or by an entity that's basically like a service provider, all of them need to have an agreement with the entity that assigns all of the rights that is being created. Because the moment somebody creates that document, software, code, or any sort of design, any sort of IP, it's owned and the rights in with that is by them, right? You need to have an assignment agreement or some sort of agreement that basically assigns the rights over that intellectual property to the business. And if you don't have that, that can be a really big red flag when you go through due diligence in an investment round. When with regards to intellectual property, it kind of goes hand in hand. But with regards to intellectual property protection, it's about registering your copyrights, trademarks. If you have any patents, then registering those. If you have any designs, registering those. These are all sorts of IP protection that you can go out and do. An ESOP plan, which is short for basically having an ESOP pool, which is shares which are assigned to a group of individuals that later you can add to. So these are for your core team members that maybe your first 5, 10, 50 employees that you find that are contributing highly towards the growth of the business and at an early stage. So that's giving them ESOP options, right? Vesting is something that goes hand in hand with co-foundership agreement. Usually your co-foundership agreement will have a vesting schedule. The typical or very, commonly used vesting plan is where there's a 1 year cliff and a overall 4 year vesting schedule. So this is where the first 12 months or 1 year essentially is where if somebody leaves, then they don't get any equity or they don't get to keep any equity. And once they've completed that cliff period, that's once they will actually only be able to get a smaller percentage. It's usually 25% of the overall equity that they've been promised. And then over the remainder of those 3 years, they will get the remaining 25% on a yearly basis. Sometimes it's done on a monthly, sometimes it's done on a quarterly basis. But essentially, what vesting means is and it only comes into the picture when somebody's leaving because um, until and unless that person is continuing to work in your organization, it it's essentially considered that that person has the shares that has been promised to them. The vesting only comes into the picture when someone's leaving. You basically calculate how many months they've stayed, have they completed their cliff period, so on and so forth. So now we're moving into the key concepts. Key contracts, my bad. So what are some of the key contracts? I've done it mainly for tech startups, primarily because Founder Institute has a majority of tech startups. However, of course, there are a bunch of other contracts that startups in general would need or businesses in general will need. And we can obviously go over that. But for for now, we're going to talk about these few agreements. One is your end user license agreement, which is commonly known as a EULA agreement. This usually sits on your website or app, most likely if you have some form of a licensing software, a SaaS business, and SaaS businesses also sometimes have a master service agreement, which is also mentioned down there as the MSA. So these are two agreements that are used for SaaS businesses, online apps, and things of that nature. It's basically allowing the user and granting the user a license to use the software. Now, with software development agreements, this is where you're essentially going to an agency, or it could even be a freelancer or an individual to develop the software on your behalf, right? And this is one of the types of agreements that I mentioned earlier that you need to have so that your IP rights are assigned to the organization. So your startup will sign this software development agreement with the software developer, basically, and that's how you'll basically have the rights over that IP. And those clauses will be mentioned in this software development agreement. You have to be careful because you want to have the option to have your own, eventually you may have your own CTO or tech team, and you would want to improve on that technology that somebody has basically made your MVP or beta version, right? Now, with regards to a non-disclosure, this is some of the most commonly signed agreements, which is either when you're getting into an investment discussions or when you're getting into a new contract with any sort of agency, whether it's a marketing agency, whether it's a financial agency, you want to have this non-disclosure agreement. This is essentially so that both parties don't disclose confidential information. It's also known as a confidentiality agreement. And there are two types of NDAs, one which is a mutual and one which is a unilateral, right? So mutual is where both parties essentially agree to saying we won't share each other's confidential information. A unilateral one is where it's one-sided, and basically it's because the other side isn't sharing any confidential information. And it's a less common use, but it's mostly used when you're having an investor on board and you want it to be a unilateral one. I already mentioned the MSA agreement, but um, it can be explored more deeply when you have maybe, let's say, you have a software solution that multiple service providers are providing different pieces of support. It could be maybe you have an agreement with a vendor who's providing system admin support. Maybe somebody that's providing supports for HR management and HR technology skills, right? So you'll have an agreement with each of these vendors. The software license agreement is essentially when you have created your software or you've gotten somebody to create your software and you're further licensing it to another entity to basically use that. It could be a way in which you want to expand to a new jurisdiction, or it could be a way in which your SaaS model is based on, right? And lastly, internet policies. This is a bunch of agreements. It can be your terms and conditions, your website's privacy policy, your copyright notice, your cancellation, refund policy. It's a bunch of agreements all bundle into internet policies, which is something that we commonly help clients draft and make sure that it's in the right tone, providing the right information, and customized for the clients that we work with. So just want to touch up more deeply into intellectual property here. Now, how do you identify and protect intellectual property, right? One, as I mentioned, is make sure that the IP is owned in a way that allows you to further develop, right? Because if you don't have those rights, one is it becomes a red flag for investors, but two is it becomes problematic for you because at any point in time, if you've gone and developed anything further, new updates, pushed a new, let's say, a module that hasn't been created by the original software development team, then you could be opening up yourself to a legal dispute between the software developer and yourselves. Uh, Next is you want to create awareness amongst your employees regarding IP security. Now, this doesn't mean to say that tell everybody, hey, don't share any documents, don't send any files, and so on and so forth, right? But have sessions, whether it's around awareness and training, about the importance of intellectual property, and the importance of the code, the design, the brand guidelines, and so on and so forth that you would eventually at certain point in time create and have as standard policies of your agreements of your startup. Speaking of standard agreements, the next is to have standard boilerplate IP clauses, right? So these are clauses that in any contract that you sign, it needs to look and seem and fit the clause that you've already gone ahead and drafted, right? So if you're signing an agreement and it doesn't give you royalty-free license, then that's something you would want to basically tweak and add to, right? And you would always be able to refer somebody else's agreement which has this clause and compare it with your standard clause for intellectual property. When we go to the next ones is, as I mentioned earlier, applying for trademarks, copyrights, patents. They are all used interchangeably, used usually by laymen, but they're very different intellectual properties. They are for different purposes, and they all have different sorts of registration processes, costs in different jurisdictions, right? So quickly, I'll just go over trademarks, copyrights, and patents, whilst there are two, three others that are also there, like geographical indication, but that's not really used. And also design patents, right? Or industrial designs. They call the different terms in different jurisdictions, but they're not very commonly used, especially in startups. What we do have is trademarks, which can be your logo. Your trademarks are of two types mainly. One is a word mark and one is a design mark. Your word mark gives you the right over the word or the combination of these words. So, for example, your virtual legal counsel, that's a trademark in itself, and it gives me the rights to use your virtual legal counsel in that combination, right? It does not give me the rights over just legal, just your legal counsel. It's all of them in that same combination. Now, if I want to talk about my logo and my design, that's a separate application that I would do. And each of these applications need to be in the right class. When we talk about trademark classes, there are 45 classes, and they are basically split between products and services. Now moving to patents. This is something that a lot of startups say that they have, but ultimately when you're a tech startup and you've developed a software, it's very rare that you'll be able to get a patent over your software. Softwares are usually copyrights. Patents are usually when you've developed an actual product that is used in either making another product, so in the process, because you can have two types of patents. One is a product patent and another is a process patent. The process patent is a patent when you're basically making some sort of machinery that allows a product to be manufactured in a more faster, more uniquely and different manner. The other one is where the product itself has a unique play and it's completely different, unseen before. You need to be careful when you're doing patents because patents, you have to apply for them before you show and reveal the product to the world, right? So before you take it to market, you need to already go ahead and apply. Otherwise, if you do register later and they do go through the patentability, they notice that it's come out, it's been revealed in the public domain, then you won't be able to get your patent registered. Whether Now the last bit is for copyrights. When we're talking about copyrights, you can have copyrights over anything that has been written, anything that is creative. It can be your design. You can have a copyright over your logo as well. You'll see, for example, over the Coca-Cola symbol that there's a C or an R, right? The R is when the trademark is registered, and the C symbol is for when the copyright is registered. Now, copyrights are important for startups because that's what most likely will be your protection over your software. When we're moving on to maintaining evidence while innovating, right? So this is for you internally in your um, research and development phase. You need to make sure that you're um, properly documenting every type of advancement, whether it's in terms of blueprints, whether it's in terms of, for example, Figma links and things of that nature. Have all these structures and you know uh, documents whenever you're talking to people also, right? Have the minutes of the meetings down and put into one consolidated place so you can eventually prove that this intellectual property was created by you or was initiated by you. And even if in the absence of an agreement, you can show these sorts of documents as evidence for you to prove your rights and ownership. Now, avoid joint ownership of IPR. So this is where either the a co-founder or an owner of the business also owns a trademark, for example. That's a big red flag for investors because ultimately you could, in your personal capacity, ask the business to pay you either a royalty or a license fee. And those are structures which would essentially take money out of the business, out of the cash flow of the company that they are investing into. Lastly is to draft strong NDAs. So ideally, an NDA would be one of your first standard agreement that you would want drafted for your company that you would essentially make any employee, any partner, any agency that you work with to sign over. So next we're going to get into regulations, which is getting towards the end of my session. How do you manage regulations, right? So one is, of course, the obvious, try to get an external professional, somebody that's either a lawyer or somebody that works with the government in terms of policy making and things like that, to basically assist you on new regulations that are coming about, as well as existing regulations that are in place, right? The next bit is to have somebody that works as either a company secretary or works as somebody that helps you maintain corporate compliance, right? So this is basically their the work that they do on a day-to-day basis. They've done it for multiple clients and they do it for the jurisdiction that is specific to your entity, right? They will help you set up your company. They will help you maintain your books of accounts. They will help you also um, uh, go ahead and file. Let's say you're having a new director on your board, you're having a new shareholder added to to your entity. Then all of these things will be basically handled by them. So make sure you have a well-rounded, whether it's a law firm, company secretary, or accounts finance a specialist. All of these have to come with the right certifications and professional accreditations that you would want to have. Now, lastly, we're getting into the legal applicability, right? So how much does the law really matter to your business? That's something that only you and your professional legal expert can tell, right? So at times it depends on which industry you're working in, right? So, for example, you're working in, let's say, the healthcare, finance, technology. There can be a lot of regulations that are involved, and law is super important for you. And you need to dedicate a few hours every day, every week towards the updates, towards the changes that are happening in your specific country, of course, right? Next is, of course, compliance is preferred over complaints, especially by investors, right? So this really means that they would rather have you um, protect your business, make sure you're getting the right advice, make sure you're hedging the risk, so to speak, right? Of getting a lawsuit or having any sort of liability coming in towards the business. And that's one thing that investors would prefer seeing, right? It's essentially prevention is better than cure, as doctors would call it. Um, Next is with regards to company law, tax law, labor laws. These are all super, super important for any business, especially if you're operating a startup that is not a one-man show, right, or one-woman show. It's important to have these because you will come across multiple issues, whether it's with regards to tax, labor, intellectual property, and also with regards to companies, right? So it's a given that these are the main pillars of the legal field that will set up the structure of legal operations of your business. Um, Next is you're gonna definitely be signing multiple contracts, right? Now, you can't go and call your lawyer for every contract that you need to be signing, right? Or you can't be because A, most likely it will be expensive, and B, sometimes there are contracts that are not as difficult or cumbersome to decipher yourself, right? But what you need to be looking for is the validity of that contract, whether they have the right clauses in terms of the jurisdiction, the termination, the term of the contract. There's certain things that need to be looked into, and that's something that you and your lawyer can be discussing and basically set as, yes, these are the agreed sort of terms that we can go ahead and sign off of, even without having the contract go to a certain lawyer or law firm and be actually completely reviewed, right? Now, these are for low value, low risk contracts, and somebody that you work with will basically design and define what are low risk and what are high risk and what are high value and what are low value, right? You need to have this sort of pyramid system in which the base of them are the majority of the contracts, which are those contracts which you will basically be able to um, go ahead and sign once you have your set processes and defined terms in place, right? The ones that are super important at the top are the real ones that, or as they go to the top of the importance level, is where you bring your lawyer involved and have them negotiate these agreements. So, for example, an investment agreement, that's something that you definitely want to be getting your legal advisor on board and negotiate, be able to push back as much as possible. The next few things are licenses, permits, approvals. These are all things that you may need, may not know, and can become roadblocks for you in the future. So it's important to go ahead and speak to your lawyer, ask them, this is the type of business, this is my business model, this is the industry, these are the jurisdictions, and tell me what are the licenses, permits, NOCs, so on and so forth that I may be required to go ahead and obtain, right? And the last is just a word of legal advice, which is that if you don't know that there's a certain law does not mean that you can be excused, or does not mean that you will, be able to let that slide. It's something that you will still be held liable and accountable for, whether it's by a regulator, an authority, or any sort of entity as well, right? So that brings us to the end of my session. I've reserved a few 10, 15 minutes for Q&A. So feel free to either raise your hand, enter into the chat, and share those questions for me.
All right, thanks a lot, Ryan. So I think that was a great presentation and very, very detailed, which is always great. So does anyone have any questions that they want to ask? I think while they figure out what they want to ask, I think, so you've dealt with a lot of startup founders and people starting new companies. What do you find are like maybe like the top 3 or top 5 mistakes that people commonly make when dealing with legal issues?
So one is, I've known one of the most common reason for startups to fail is issues between co-founders, right? Because you start out with like all gung-ho to do this new business, and everybody's bringing their own elements, but at either a few years or a few months or many years later, there are differences, and it's important to have an agreement, which is usually, as I mentioned, your co-foundership agreement, right? Signed and drafted when all things are good, right? Because everything's good while everything's good, but when everything's bad, it can get really bad. The next thing that I think in terms of startup founders that they need to have is, of course, their website policies, especially if they're a digital business, an online business. They're either, collecting a lot of data. They have a Shopify or some sort of e-commerce website online that's either selling a product or a service, and all of their terms and conditions need to be clearly mentioned and in a language that is, not Greek and Latin for their users and their vendors or partners to be able to understand, right? And third, lastly, I think it's important to be clear and upfront with their employees and stakeholders that they work with. So these are usually internal agreements, and nobody generally sees it, but it's important to be clear with your employees, especially if you're giving them ESOPs, especially if you're giving them like commission bonuses and so on and so forth. These are things that can get messy and eventually can be a blowout on social media.
Okay, I think all very excellent points. Does anyone have any questions? So I think you've done a great job with your presentation because I don't see many hands up. Hiruni, go ahead.
Cool.
Hi, Ryan. It's nice to
Hey.
see you again, and thank you for such a
Yeah.
great session. Yeah. So I just wanted to come back to one of the initial points you made, right, about like choosing the right jurisdiction to incorporate, right? So I just want to ask, like, what things, like, I know there's things we have to consider regards to tax planning, but also where our market lies. So how do we really kind of balance that out and find the right place to incorporate? Yeah, like find
So
the right
those
jurisdiction. Yeah.
Yeah, so you're right. You're spot on with the two factors that you need to keep in mind when setting up your entity. But at the same time, there is a structure of a holding company. It's also known as a HCo or a holdco for short. But that's basically where all of your investors will invest into. It's basically the entity that will hold all of the intellectual property, will basically be the parent to the subsidiary or the child, right? And the child will basically be the operating company that is set up in the company that country that you want to basically legally launch or operate your entity. So, for example, you could have a holding company in, let's say, Delaware, or let's say Dubai, or let's say Singapore, right? These are all three with various tax structures, right? Or tax efficiencies, let's say, right? Where in Delaware it's close to zero, in Dubai it's at 9%, in Singapore it's capped at 17%. These are all three great options for your holding company. And then let's say you want to have your market launch in, for example, India or Sri Lanka or Bangladesh, then that's where you have an operating company. Your investors will hold shares in the holding company, and the investment amount that they've made into the holding company will go and be transferred to the operating company basis some sort of an agreement. It could be a management and operations agreement, it could be a licensing agreement, it could be a franchise agreement. We can figure out what the relationship would be, right? It can even be a loan between the parent company and the operating company. But ultimately, it needs to make sure that you have a legal reason for money to come from here to the operating company and for it to go back as well.
Okay. Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. So, like, this is a bit more personal in terms of the question, right? So, I currently have an incorporated company in Sri Lanka. So,
okay.
how would that work? Like,
You
so
have that
then,
already, right?
yeah. So I have to separately set up a new holding company in wherever, and then
Yes. So then,
connect.
so
Yeah.
yeah. So for example, for those that already have an entity, wherever they have their entity, and they don't have a holding company yet, or they haven't thought of having a holding company, then it's not that bad. It's not that complicated. All you need to do is figure out which country you want to have that entity as a holding entity registered. And secondly, basically make that relationship between the holding company and the operating company that you already have, which means all of the shares that your operating company has right now are transferred or owned by the holding company. So, for example, in your case, and just to make sure that everybody else doesn't have personal questions like this, I'm letting everybody know that my office hours are open. You can go ahead and go and book a session there for more contextualize and detailed questions. But for the purpose of this question, essentially what you will do is either sell all of the shares and transfer them to the holding company. Let's say you've set up a Delaware entity, you'll transfer the shares from yourself if you're the shareholder, or whoever the other shareholders, transfer it to the holding company. And that would be the way in which that would basically make it a holding company and remove yourself out of the equation. You could be a shareholder in the holding company.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. That's awesome. Yeah. Thanks, Ryan.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Happy to help. Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so thanks a lot for that answer. And I can see Inside with his hands up. Inside, you can go ahead and ask.
Yeah, it's also a personalized question, so I believe it's better to ask during an office hour with Ryan, I believe.
Sure, we
Well,
can.
Well, I don't see anyone
I
else
can,
with their hands up, so I would just say go ahead and ask.
yeah.
If somebody
I'll
else
give you
had
a
their
generic
hands up,
answer.
no.
Yeah,
Yeah, so can I ask my question?
sure, go for it.
Yeah, so I registered my company in North Carolina just before I enrolled for the FI program. So I was striving to get the company registered in Delaware, but it was not a success due to some restrictions in getting into that particular law company, or the agent kind of things. So what I really did was I got it registered from Sri Lanka. The North Carolina was easily accessible, but that's one thing I really want to know: is it a good step I really did, or I have to change it to a different location like Delaware. The second thing is I registered as a single entity. So I was the only person. So I really did it all in a hurry. I was not by that time I was not aware of the FI program and all these things. Just a couple of weeks before the FI program was. So how do I need another co-founder to be added to my company to or is it okay to go as a solo? So what are the consequences of it, kind of?
Got it. Yeah. So to answer your question in a general manner, right, for the benefit of everybody, one is usually solo founders are frowned upon by investors, so they don't prefer investing in solo founder startups for multiple reasons. They also don't, at least depending on the investor, they also don't prefer to invest into first-time founders, right? There's a certain stigma that goes to that, right? Which of course you will overcome when it's your first startup eventually. But coming back to your question, right, is yeah, most likely having a single member LLC, which is I'm assuming what you have, not the best entity to raise funds for, and at the same time, not the best entity to even use as your operating entity, especially if you're going to operate in all 50 states or in other parts of the world or even in other parts of North America, right? Let's say you wanted to operate in US and Canada, for instance. A single member LLC in North Carolina is probably not going to be the best choice for you. So we'll have to sit together and kind of rework that. I'm assuming you didn't spend too much money and time and effort into setting up this LLC. So we'll figure out how to, properly utilize the funds that you did put into that, and maybe it can be helpful for something else, right? Maybe if you want to do some sort of freelance side business on the side, but for the most part, I don't feel it's going to be helpful for you in your, startups structure.
I'll
So,
discuss
so,
with
so
the
if, so if
judge.
Delaware was difficult for whatever reason, we can either give it another go, or you can look at Wyoming. That's another state that is preferred for startups, for investors, for raising funds, and so on and so forth.
Okay, good. I will have an office hour and we
Sure.
will discuss the specifics of the problem.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, all right. So I think
Anybody else with any questions?
so I don't see any hands up, and I think we're just
Okay.
past 8:30, so I think we can
Cool.
wrap up. So thanks a lot,
Thank
Ryan,
you.
so much. I think for giving
Fantastic.
your time and also on a really short notice. So I mean, it was a great session, and I think you gave a lot of it was a very detailed presentation, which would have been really useful for the founders as well. So thank you so much for your time. So we're going to move to the next segment of the session. So
I'll
you're
drop off. Yeah.
free to go. Yeah, free to go.
Cool. Awesome. Thank you. It's such a pleasure.
right.
And yeah, thanks everybody. Hope you all enjoyed
Definitely
this
have you
session.
back again.
Sure. Happy to be here next time as well. Take
All
care.
right.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Okay,
Bye-bye.
so I'm
Thanks.
gonna shift everyone to gallery view so y'all can. I know people seem to be very camera shy, but I